The scent of fresh coffee and printer ink filled the small, sunlit office of my attorney as I waited, my fingers tracing the edge of a legal pad. I was 59 years old, and after 35 years of marriage, I was finally signing the papers that would end it. But Charles wasn't going to let me go without a fight. He was fighting dirty, and I was terrified he would win. Then my daughter, Kate, walked in, her face pale but determined, and placed a single, unmarked USB drive on the sleek desk between us. "Mom," she said, her voice a quiet tremor of fury, "he messed with the wrong women." What was on that drive would unravel his entire world. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how we got here. If you've ever felt a cage you couldn't see, if you've ever smiled while something inside you was dying, then you understand. Subscribe to this channel. Stay with me. There are more stories like mine to tell. 3 months earlier, I had been standing at the granite island in the kitchen of the home Charles and I had shared since our daughter was 5. It was a Thursday. The morning sun streamed through the bay window, illuminating dust motes dancing above a vase of perfect white lilies. I was preparing his breakfast, steel-cut oatmeal with a precise tablespoon of maple syrup, 2 slices of dry rye toast, black coffee in the white ceramic mug he preferred. The routine was a liturgy, performed without thought for over 12,000 days. "Eleanor," his voice, not a call but a summons, bounced down the staircase. "The financial statements from last quarter. I need them for the 10 o'clock call. They should be in my study." I wiped my hands on a dish towel. I had organized and filed them in the black accordion folder, section Q3, as I did every quarter. They were exactly where he expected them to be. "They're in the study, Charles. Black folder, 3rd shelf." I heard the muffled sound of drawers opening and closing, the rustle of paper. Silence. He'd found them. There would be no acknowledgement. My role was to be a flawless, silent system in the background of his life. Charles Prescott, 62, retired partner of a prestigious investment firm, a man for whom control was not a desire, but an operating system. He'd retired 18 months ago, and my world had shrunk to the exact dimensions of this 4,200 square foot house. Every minute was subject to audit. He entered the kitchen, immaculate in a cashmere sweater and chinos. He didn't look at me as he sat at the head of the table. He took a sip of coffee, lukewarm. It had been brewing 90 seconds ago. Steam still curled from the pot. "I'll make a fresh pot," I said, my voice a familiar, neutral tone. "See that you do." He opened the newspaper. "Eleanor, we need to discuss Thanksgiving. My mother feels a buffet is too informal. We'll do a seated dinner. You'll need to finalize the menu with the caterer by Friday." I poured the entire carafe down the sink, the sound a hollow gurgle. For 35 years, I had cooked Thanksgiving dinner. It was my one culinary passion, my domain. Last year, as a kindness, because I was getting older, he had hired a caterer. I had been relegated to arranging flowers. "I'd like to cook this year, Charles. Kate loves the traditional meal." He lowered the paper. His eyes, a cool gray, met mine. "The caterer is already selected. Mother prefers it. It's settled." Something fizzed in my veins, a strange, foreign carbonation. It was Thanksgiving. It was my daughter. It was a turkey and stuffing and my great-grandmother's china. "No," I said. The word hung in the air between us, small and shocking, like a lone firecracker. His head tilted. "I beg your pardon?" "I said no. I am cooking Thanksgiving dinner. Your mother is welcome to join us at a buffet." I emphasized the word, feeling reckless. He set the paper down with precise slowness. The air grew dense. "Your home," he said, his voice soft but taut. "The mortgage is in my name. The utilities, the taxes, the very groceries you're proposing to ruin, all on accounts I fund. Your sentimentality is not a valid business decision. The caterer will be here at noon on the 25th. You will coordinate with them." He walked out, leaving his uneaten oatmeal and the specter of my defiance hanging in the sunlit room. I stood there trembling, staring at the congealing oats. The disaster salmon had been slightly oversalted. One guest, a business associate, had joked about it. Charles had not spoken to me for 2 days. That was the economy of our marriage. My errors were catastrophic, his decrees were law. But as I stood there, a single, clear thought emerged. I would not be coordinating with any caterer. That afternoon, I called my older sister, Marianne. She lived 2 hours away and had been my silent lifeline for decades. He said, "What?" Her voice was sharp. "Eleanor, you need to leave. Not after Thanksgiving. Now." "I can't just leave, Marianne. Everything is... It's what, a beautiful prison? You're 59. You were a talented graphic designer. You gave it up because he said a wife of a partner shouldn't have a commercial job. You have nothing in your name. I've been researching. This is financial abuse. It's psychological abuse. You have to see it." I looked around the perfect kitchen, the sub-zero refrigerator, the Wolf range, the spotless countertops. It was a showroom. It was not a home. It was a set where I played the part of the contented wife. Where would I go? "My guest room is always yours. We'll figure it out, but you have to do something, one thing, just for you." After we hung up, I did something I hadn't done in 15 years. I drove to an art supply store. I bought a sketch pad, a set of charcoal pencils, and a large, beautiful eraser. I hid them in the back of my closet, behind my winter sweaters. That night, after Charles was asleep, I took them out and sketched the vase of lilies on my dressing table. My lines were shaky, but the act felt like treason and baptism all at once. Thanksgiving was a cold, seated affair with his mother's china and a catered turkey that tasted like cardboard. Kate, my 28-year-old, brilliant, fierce daughter, shot me sympathetic looks all evening. She knew. She'd always known. When Charles and his mother debated the merits of various investment portfolios in the living room, Kate cornered me in the kitchen as I pretended to tidy. "Mom, when are you going to leave him?" she whispered, her hand on my arm. The question, so blunt, stole my breath. "Kate, it's complicated." "It's not. He's a bully. He's made you small. I see it. Aunt Marianne sees it. You need to see it." Her eyes, my own hazel eyes reflected back, were fierce with love. "I have a spare room. You just have to say the word." The word. It seemed so simple. That night, lying beside Charles's sleeping form, the word took shape. Enough. 6 weeks after Thanksgiving, I retained an attorney. Her name was Sarah Jensen. She had a calm, steely presence and an office that smelled like lemons and resolve. "Eleanor," she said, after I'd haltingly outlined 35 years in 35 minutes, "what you're describing is a pattern of coercive control. The fact that you have no assets in your name is a huge problem, but not an insurmountable one. You are entitled to half of the marital estate. Do you have any records of his assets? Any idea of the accounts?" I shook my head. "He handled everything. He'd give me a credit card for household expenses. I have the statements, but they're just groceries, cleaning supplies, my clothing. We'll subpoena everything, but he will fight. Men like him always do." She leaned forward. "Has he made any threats since you told him you were filing?" I had told him the previous evening. His reaction was not explosive anger, but a glacial, disdainful calm. He'd smiled. It was the most frightening thing I'd ever seen. "Eleanor, you are being profoundly foolish. You are 59 years old. You have no independent income, no recent work history, no marketable skills. Your sister and your daughter have filled your head with feminist fantasy. The reality is that you walk out that door, you will be destitute. I will make sure of it. I will litigate you into the ground. You will spend every penny you might hope to get on legal fees, and at the end, everyone will know you as the hysterical, menopausal woman who destroyed a perfectly good marriage for a whim." He then picked up his book. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm reading. Do what you want, you always do eventually, and you always come back. I relayed this to Sarah Jensen. Her pen tapped a steady rhythm on her legal pad. Document every interaction. Save every text, every email. If he says these things in person, write it down with the date and time immediately after. This is a campaign of intimidation. We will use it. I moved in with Kate the next day. My suitcase held my clothes, my hidden sketch pad, and a framed photo of my parents. Kate's apartment was a cozy, book-filled haven in a bustling neighborhood. It smelled of her lavender candle and possibility. That first night, we ordered pizza and drank wine straight from the bottle. I felt giddy and nauseous with fear. "I'm proud of you, Mom," said Kate, squeezing my hand. "This is the first day of the rest of your life." But Charles's prediction began to materialize with terrifying speed. His attorney, a man named Douglas Finch with a voice like smoothed gravel, filed motion after motion. He requested my mental health records, alleging erratic behavior and acute anxiety made me incapable of rational decision-making. He subpoenaed Kate's financial records, implying she was coercing me for her own gain. The legal bills Sarah Jensen sent, though she was working on a partial contingency, made me break out in a cold sweat. Charles was using the legal system as a weapon, just as he'd promised. Then, the first concrete blow landed. Sarah called me, her voice tight. "Eleanor, he's frozen all the joint accounts, and he's filed a motion to have you removed from the house, claiming you abandoned the marital home, and he needs sole possession to maintain its value. He's also presented an initial asset disclosure that is laughably low." "How low?" "He's claiming the total marital estate is worth approximately $850,000. I almost dropped the phone. "That's impossible. The house alone is worth over $2 million. He had investment accounts, his retirement. He managed millions for clients. Our lifestyle." "I know. He's hiding assets. This is where it gets ugly. We need to find them. Do you have anything? Old tax returns, bank statements, anything with account numbers?" I racked my brain. Charles had a locked filing cabinet in his study. I had never had the key, but I remembered something. Years ago, maybe 10, he'd thrown his back out and was bedridden for a week. He'd asked me to fetch a specific file from his cabinet. He'd told me the key was in the small ceramic dish on his dresser, the one that held his cufflinks. I'd gotten the file. I'd seen the neatly labeled folders: Vanguard, IRA, Fidelity, Joint, Morgan Stanley, Trust. I had no numbers, but I had names. I told Sarah. "That's a start," she said, "but we need numbers. We need proof he's lying under oath." I felt helpless, but Kate was not. That evening, I found her at her desk, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Mom, what's the name of his old firm and his longtime assistant?" "Barrows and Keating. His assistant was Susan Ellis. Why?" "Just a hunch," Kate said, her fingers flying across her keyboard. "People are creatures of habit. Passwords, security questions, they reuse them. They confide in longtime assistants." "Kate, what are you doing?" "What you taught me to do," she said, smiling grimly. "Research." A week later, we had the custody hearing, not for a child, but for our family dog, a gentle old golden retriever named Bear. It was a strategic move by Finch, Sarah explained. He's using Bear to force you into court, to establish a pattern of you being unreasonable. It's a power play, a cruel one. In the sterile courtroom, Charles looked every inch of the wronged patriarch. He wore a somber suit and a look of paternal disappointment. When the judge asked why this matter required court intervention, Finch stood. "Your Honor, my client is deeply attached to Bear, a dog he has raised from a puppy. Mrs. Prescott removed the dog from the home without discussion, causing my client significant distress. Given Mrs. Prescott's current unstable housing situation, living in a small apartment, and her demonstrated impulsivity, we believe the dog's well-being is best served by returning him to his stable, long-term home. Sarah objected. Your Honor, Bear is 17 years old, largely incontinent, and requires significant medication and care, which Mr. Prescott has never administered. My client has been Bear's primary caretaker for his entire life. Her current apartment is perfectly suitable, and the dog's veterinarian will attest to his improved comfort since the move. The judge, a weary-looking man, rubbed his temples. This is a dog, not a child. Mr. Prescott, did you administer this medication? Charles stood, his voice oozing sincere regret. Your Honor, I traveled frequently for work. Eleanor always handled the household matters, but my schedule is now entirely open. I am more than capable of learning. Bear is a living creature who has known only one home for 17 years. Uprooting him now in his fragile state seems needlessly cruel. I felt Kate stiffen beside me. She had Bear on a leash at her feet. The dog was asleep, snoring softly. The callousness of using this old, loyal animal as a pawn made my stomach turn. The judge was about to rule when Kate's hand shot up. Your Honor, may I speak? I'm Catherine Prescott, their daughter. I live with my mother. The judge sighed but nodded. Briefly, Ms. Prescott. Kate stood. She pulled out her phone. Your Honor, my father hasn't asked about Bear's health once since we left, not a single call or text. However, he has sent over 60 emails to my mother about the divorce proceedings, many of which are threatening. I believe his concern for Bear is not genuine. Furthermore, she took a breath, I have a recording from the day my mother moved out. My father was not home. I went to the house to help her get some last items. My father called the landline. I answered. He didn't know it was me. He thought it was my mother. She pressed play on her phone. Charles's voice, tinny but unmistakable, filled the room. Eleanor, listen to me. You bring the dog back today, or I will make sure you never see a cent. I will bury you in legal fees so deep you'll be begging to come back. The dog is property, marital property, and you stole it. A beat of silence on the recording. Then Kate's voice, young and clear. Dad, it's Kate. Bear is with me. He's fine. A longer silence. Then the line went dead. The judge looked from Charles's suddenly flushed face to Bear, peacefully snoring. Case dismissed, he said flatly. The dog remains with Ms. Prescott and Mrs. Prescott. Mr. Prescott, this court's time is valuable. Do not waste it again with frivolous motions. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. It was the first time his bluff had been called. But the financial battle was the true war. The discovery process was a nightmare of obfuscation. Charles produced only the statements for the accounts he'd already disclosed, the checking, the savings, a modest IRA. Sarah sent subpoenas to the institutions I'd named, Vanguard, Fidelity, Morgan Stanley. The responses trickled in. No accounts under his Social Security number, no joint accounts with my name. He's used a tax ID number, Sarah concluded, a business entity, or he's transferred assets. We need to find the entity. I was sinking into despair. The legal bills were mounting. Kate was spending every spare moment digging online, her eyes ringed with exhaustion. It's like he's a ghost, she muttered one night. He's too smart to have everything just in his name. There has to be a shell company, something with Prescott in it. Then I remembered, not an account, but a place. Early in our marriage, before Charles became a partner, we'd rented a safety deposit box at First Mercantile Trust. We'd put in our marriage certificate, my grandmother's pearls, his first silver dollar. He'd mentioned closing it years later when we got a home safe, but had he? Or had he just transferred the contents to a new box in only his name? I mentioned it to Sarah. It's a long shot, but we can subpoena the bank. If there's a box, we can petition the court to have it inventoried. It could hold documents. The subpoena was issued. The bank's response came 2 weeks later. Charles Prescott maintained a single-person safety deposit box, box number 722, at their downtown branch, leased annually with automatic renewal. The last access, according to their records, was 3 days after I filed for divorce. Sarah filed an emergency motion to inventory the box. Finch objected vehemently, claiming it contained only personal, sentimental items of no marital value, and that the subpoena was a fishing expedition. The judge, perhaps remembering the dog incident, ordered the inventory. We would all meet at the bank. The morning of the inventory, my hands were ice. Charles arrived with Finch. He didn't look at me. A bank manager, a court clerk, and a uniformed security guard escorted us into the vault. The air was cold and still. The manager inserted her key. Charles inserted his. Box number 722 slid out. It was larger than I expected, a long metal rectangle. The court clerk placed it on a table in a private room. "Mr. Prescott, please open it." Charles's jaw was clenched. He turned the key, lifted the lid. Inside, I saw what I expected: a few document folders, a small velvet pouch, perhaps the pearls, some old coins. But the clerk, following procedure, began removing and cataloging each item. She opened the first folder. It contained passports, his and one for me I never knew existed. She opened the second. It held what looked like property deeds. She read the top one aloud. "Quit-claim deed for property located at 1142 Cove Road, Shell Point, Florida." She looked at the next. "Annual statement for the Pinecrest Holdings, LLC, operating account, First Caribbean International Bank, account number ending in 4481, balance as of December 31st, $2,850,467.22. The room went utterly silent. I felt the blood drain from my face. Pinecrest Holdings, a shell company, a Caribbean bank account, millions. The clerk continued, her voice monotone against the pounding in my ears. "Registered agent for Pinecrest Holdings, LLC, Charles Prescott. Federal tax ID number, withheld." She pulled out another statement. "Morgan Stanley account under Pinecrest Holdings, balance $1.4 million. Another. Deed for a condominium at the Harborside, Unit 304, Shell Point, Florida." Charles had bought a condo in Florida without me, with our marital money. Finch was staring at his client, a barely concealed look of horror on his face. Charles was white, his composure finally shattered. He looked at me then, and in his eyes I saw pure, unadulterated hatred. "This appears to be a substantial, undisclosed marital asset," the court clerk said, stating the obvious with bureaucratic calm. That was the proof. Concrete, irrefutable. The judge, upon receiving the inventory, was livid. He sanctioned Charles for litigation misconduct, ordering him to pay a significant portion of my attorney's fees immediately and to unfreeze all joint accounts. More importantly, the hidden assets, the condo, the millions in the shell company, were now on the table. The balance of power had shifted. But Charles was not done. The main divorce hearing was scheduled. Sarah was confident. "With this level of malfeasance, Eleanor, the court will likely award you more than 50%, possibly 60 or 70, given his attempt to hide assets and his conduct." I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt a deep, weary anxiety. Charles's retaliation would be severe. He'd promised to destroy me, and I'd just proven he was a liar and a thief in the eyes of the law. His ego would not survive it. 2 days before the final hearing, Kate came home from work late. She worked as a data analyst for a nonprofit. Her face was grim. She walked straight to her computer. "Mom, sit down. I found something else. Something worse. Worse than a secret condo and $3 million? Yes. Her fingers flew. After we found Pinecrest Holdings, I started digging into its digital footprint, incorporation papers, whatever I could find. It's hard with offshore stuff. But I remembered something. Dad's old firm, Barrows and Keating, had a data breach about 5 years ago. Employee emails were leaked. It was big news in finance circles. The files are archived in a public database online for cybersecurity researchers. A cold dread crept up my spine. And I found his old work email address in the leak. I started searching for any emails with attachments, any with the word Pinecrest or Shellpoint. I found a few boring ones. Then I found this. She pulled up a scanned document on her screen. It was a prenuptial agreement. My heart stopped. We did not have a prenup. We'd married young, with nothing. But this was a prenuptial agreement between Charles Prescott and a woman named Elise Brennan. The date was 5 years ago. The signatures were Charles's and a woman's. It was notarized. "I don't understand," I whispered. "Keep reading," Kate said, her voice hard. The agreement outlined the division of assets in the event of a divorce between Charles and Elise. It referenced shared property in Shellpoint, Florida. It referenced the assets of Pinecrest Holdings, LLC. He was married? The words were a gasp. No, look at the notary date. It's 3 years after the date on the document. He backdated it. This is a fraudulent document, Mom. I think he created a fake wife, a fake ex-wife, to explain the assets, to explain the condo. If anyone ever dug up Pinecrest, he could say, "Oh, those are assets from my previous marriage to Elise Brennan, protected by this prenup." He built a whole fictional life to hide money from you. The sheer audacity of it stole the air from the room. The planning, the deceit, it was a masterpiece of betrayal. "We have to give this to Sarah," I said, numb. "There's more," Kate said. She opened an audio file. I cross-referenced the name Elise Brennan with the email leak. I found an email chain between Gad and someone with that name. It's clearly him talking to himself from a different email account. But in one, he's dictating a backstory. I used text-to-speech software to generate audio from it, to hear him say it. She pressed play. Charles's voice, slightly distorted by the digital generation but undeniably his, filled the quiet room. "Elise and I were married in 2010 in a private ceremony in the Bahamas. The marriage ended amicably in 2015. She waived all claims to the Pinecrest assets in exchange for the Clearwater property. She now lives abroad and has no contact. That is the story. Stick to it." Kate stopped the playback. "He created a ghost to haunt you, to steal from you." That was the USB drive she brought to Sarah Jensen's office the next day, the one she placed on the desk. He messed with the wrong women. The final hearing was not the anticlimax I expected. It was a rout. Sarah entered the fraudulent prenuptial agreement, the fabricated email chain, and the audio into evidence. She laid out the timeline, the creation of Pinecrest Holdings, the funneling of marital assets into it, the purchase of the Florida condo, and the elaborate fabrication of a prior marriage to justify it all. Charles's attorney, Douglas Finch, asked for a recess to consult with his client. When they returned, Finch's demeanor had changed. He looked like a man who wanted to be anywhere else. "Your Honor, my client would like to make a statement." Charles stood. He looked aged, deflated. The arrogant confidence was gone, replaced by a shamed rigidity. "Your Honor, I acted out of fear and poor judgment. I deeply regret the decisions I have made during this process. I wish to settle this matter amicably today, according to Mrs. Prescott's terms. The judge, a woman named Judge Alvarez, peered at him over her glasses. "Mr. Prescott, poor judgment is forgetting to pay a parking ticket. What you have engaged in is a systematic, premeditated scheme to defraud your wife of 35 years of her rightful share of marital assets. It is perjury. It is fraud upon this court. I am referring this matter to the district attorney for criminal investigation. As for today's settlement," she turned to Sarah. "Counselor, what are Mrs. Prescott's terms?" Sarah didn't hesitate. "Given the egregious conduct, we seek 70% of all marital assets, including the full value of the Pinecrest Foldings LLC assets and the Shell Point condominium, which we ask be awarded solely to Mrs. Prescott. We also seek all attorney fees and a substantial cash equalization payment from Mr. Prescott's remaining 30% to account for the emotional distress and litigation abuse." Judge Alvarez nodded. "Given the circumstances, those terms are more than reasonable. So ordered. The divorce is granted. Asset division per Mrs. Prescott's terms. Mr. Prescott, you will comply fully with the asset transfer within 30 days. And good luck with the DA's office." She banged her gavel. It was over. I walked out of the courtroom into the blinding afternoon sun, holding Kate's hand. There was no euphoria, just a profound, bone-deep relief, as if a constant, crushing pressure had suddenly been lifted. I could breathe. That was 8 months ago. I am 60 years old now. I sold the big house. It held only ghosts. I sold the Florida condo. It held only lies. With my share, I bought a light-filled loft in the city's arts district. One whole wall is windows. The back half is my studio. I have a giant drafting table, shelves for my paints, and a tabby cat named Nimbus who sleeps in a sunbeam. I enrolled in a graphic design refresher course. The software has changed, but the principles haven't, and my hands remember. I've started freelancing, designing logos and book covers. My first client was a women's shelter. I did the work pro bono. It felt like a circle closing. Charles pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor charge of filing a false instrument to avoid a protracted trial. He paid a fine and did community service. The news was a small, satisfying footnote. He lives in a smaller house now. Mutual acquaintances say he is bitter, alone, telling a revised version of history where he was the victim of an ungrateful wife and a manipulative daughter. I don't think about him much. When I do, I feel pity, a distant, quiet pity for a man who built fortresses of money but lived in a desert of his own making. Kate comes over every Tuesday for dinner. We cook together, experimenting with recipes, making messes, laughing. Sometimes Marianne drives in, and the three of us drink wine and talk late into the night. I am painting again, not just sketching. Bold, abstract pieces full of color I never allowed myself before. Last month, a local gallery included one in a group show. It sold on opening night. The title was Box 722. On my bookshelf, next to a thriving succulent, sits that unmarked USB drive. It's not a trophy of his defeat. It's a monument to my daughter's love and her fierce, brilliant mind. It's a reminder that sometimes the truth is hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right person to look. It's a testament to the fact that no cage, no matter how gilded, is inescapable when someone on the outside is working to pick the lock. I am 60 years old. I am divorced. I am a designer. I am an artist. I am a mother, a sister, a friend. I am free. And my story is just one of many. If you have a story like mine, a cage you're trying to leave, tell it in the comments below. You are not alone. And if you want to hear more stories of women finding their strength, subscribe to the channel. Stay with us. The next chapter is always being written.